What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. This is your boy Frankie Bones, and in today's video we're going to be diving into the CDL Major 5 tournament coming up this next weekend up north of the border in Toronto. We're going to recap some of our Major 5 qualifiers, talk some major storylines as we look forward towards the championship tournament later on in June, and ultimately preview all the matchups and let you guys know who I think is going to win, although I think you guys already know where I'm going with this video. Before we get too deep here, just wanted to say, if you guys enjoyed this video, please feel free to drop a like, comment down below if you guys disagree with any of my opinions as we talk through some of these storylines and some of my predictions in the games, and subscribe if you guys are new for more CDL content, more Call of Duty content in general, whether it's my ranked play videos, pubs, updates, anything like that. So we'll hop right into it with some quick previews of the Major 5 qualifiers. OpTic Texas, they end up qualifying again with another perfect round. They go 5-0. They beat Florida this past weekend, and I believe they're the first team in CDL history to go back-to-back with perfect qualifier periods, so pretty exciting. Everything seems to be trending in the right direction for this OpTic Texas team. Yes, they fell a little bit short last major, but a little bit phony of a major. Obviously, the green wall will definitely travel up north over the border. Moving on to our next talking point, we'll talk about the Minnesota Rocker. They win an absolutely massive series against the Toronto Ultra this past weekend, and this is sort of twofold for the Minnesota Rocker. So they end up winning this series. Obviously, they bring back Attached 2-0 on the weekend, and they look really good. And you know, overall, the most important thing is that they end up making winners after this win with a 3-2 record, rather. And now they're 20 points up on the Las Vegas Legion. And we'll talk about it a little bit later as we take a peek over at the bracket and talk about our predictions. But just an incredibly massive win for them. They're looking pretty good. Fame looks comfortable on the SMG. And obviously, you know, Dylan Attached just continues to do his thing. I don't think it was the right move to bench him, and he came out with that fire, and I think that was really important for this team overall as they make the push for champs. Next note that we'll talk about, the Boston Breach. They end up beating a trolling NYSL team to end up getting the 4th seed, and sort of twofold with this bullet here. Boston, they look pretty good with Vivid here. His numbers haven't been spectacular, but they've been able to convert and get some wins. Again, it's online, and we know they've been farming the Sound EQ cheese, but they end up looking pretty good. Obviously, they get a winner's bracket look, and pretty interesting for them as they move forward into the bracket, and most likely solidify a champ spot. So really big for them. Obviously, NYSL already had a spot, so in their last match, they decide to give their substitute player a shot and sort of expose him a little bit to the world. And, you know, Wardy played well, I will say, but just sort of odd they end up putting Kismet on the flex. Guys ends up being the good man that he is and takes a seat on the bench to give him the opportunity. And it just looked weird that the chemistry was never there, and just sort of seems like a sellout play to be able to try and move him in the offseason. And finally, the last thing that we'll talk about is LAT. Yes, they started out 0-4. They ended up bouncing back with 3-0 over the London Royal Ravens. Yes, they're basically roadkill at this point, but a 3-0 was big for them in terms of their confidence. They'll always have a shot. They've been proven to be able to make a loser's bracket run here, especially on LAN, and I think it was an important win for them, and we'll talk a little bit more about them when it comes to bracket play here with our predictions. So moving on to our next part of the video, I do apologize if I'm a little stuffy. The baseball field just cut today. I'm absolutely dying here in the spring in the Northeast, but again, we will carry on. The first note we'll talk about, again, sort of break it up into 3 different groups. OpTic Texas remains 15 points behind the Atlanta FaZe for the number 1 overall seed in terms of the season standings, and this will remain the case unless OpTic Texas get a second place finish and the Atlanta FaZe get 4th place or worse, or if OpTic Texas end up getting the win, they will secure the number 1 overall seed regardless of placing from the Atlanta FaZe as a result of them having the head-to-head. So an interesting note going in here because we know that OpTic Texas has been in some finals and they may have the opportunity at this point to be able to have the veto advantage, and it will be really big for them going forward. The next thing we'll talk about is those middle seeds. We have Toronto, LAT, and the New York Subliners. They all remain 20 points apart, and it'll be pretty interesting to see how this all plays out after this Major 5 tournament. I think that it is pretty important for a team to be able to push for this number 3 overall seed, and I think that, again, there's some teams in good positions. Obviously, Toronto and the New York Subliners both in a good spot, both in winner's bracket. LAT going 1-4 in the qualifying cycle, so we'll have to see how it ends up playing out, but as I listed them in order, Toronto, LAT, and YSL all 10 points apart, and we'll have to stay tuned and stay buckled in because I think it'll be a pretty wild Major 5 cycle here for us in terms of the championship seeding. And the last thing we'll talk about here for the season standings, the bottom 2 seeds continue to tighten up. We'll sort of break down which teams are in the running here and ultimately what some of the playouts may be. So talking from the different seeds that we have, in the 6 seed, we have the Boston Breach. They're at 190 points. Them and Seattle are tied, but Boston is the head-to-head. So Boston is in winners, Seattle in losers. Obviously, they've been trending a little bit downward over the past few majors, but both tied at 190. The Minnesota Rocker at 180 in winners bracket as well. And then we have the Las Vegas Legion in the 9 seed at the moment with 160. 20 points down of the Rocker and 30 down of Boston and Seattle. So wouldn't say anybody's particularly safe at this point. Obviously, there's a lot of points that can be made up throughout the Major 5 cycle, and being double-rounded is just absolutely criminal here at this point. And from a Seattle perspective, just being one and done in this tournament puts them in a really jeopardized spot in terms of champs. So we'll have to keep a close eye on exactly what happens here over this next weekend and see who ends up in there. I mean, I wouldn't say Seattle's safe at all. If they end up getting rounded, which we'll talk a little bit about in terms of our matchups, then they may not be safe. And I think there's some teams that have momentum that could sort of progress their way up this season standings and put themselves in a spot to even maybe get a first-round win in terms of their champs. And finally, with all of that said, we'll hop over to our Major 5 tournament predictions, and this is going to be a really spicy one. There's a lot of really important games in the mix here throughout this tournament schedule, so let me know what you guys think is potentially going to be the most pivotal going forward and what you guys think will happen in this tournament. But we will start here on Friday. Again, all these will be winners matchups on Friday. These matchups will start at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, so hopefully you guys are ready for a long and exciting weekend of Call of Duty content. But for the first matchup, an absolute banger in my book, we have the Atlanta FaZe going up against the Las Vegas Legion, and they do match up pretty well in terms of how they've been playing throughout the season, some of their similar modes and maps as well, but in my opinion, I'm going to give this one to the Las Vegas Legion by way of 3-2. I think that they're just incredibly hungry. And yes, the Atlanta FaZe looked better, but I may want to see Vegas Legion at champs, and I think that this is a win that they're really going to want. Obviously, FaZe wanted to, but in this instance, I'll give it to the Legion in a 3-2. The next matchup on our winners round 1 slate, we have the Toronto Ultra taking on the New York Subliners. I'm going to give this one to Toronto by way of 3-1. They've just looked in really good form. The only team that they ended up losing to at this point is OpTic Texas in this last split. And, it's pretty interesting. You can say what you want about the move by NYSL to end up playing Wardy. Yeah, it's a gentlemanlike move, but at the end of the day, they secured their spot in Major 5, but I think that they were a little bit not concerned overall about what their seeding might be in Major 5 outside of just being in winners, and I think that this sort of kills some momentum that they had, because over the course of Major 4 and Major 5, they regained some of their form that they had earlier on in the year, and I would have loved to see them just continue to roll at that point. So by way of that, I'll give that in a Toronto 3-1. For the next matchup, we have OpTic Texas taking on the Florida Mutineers, and this one will be a DoorDashy. Just kidding. I think that all these maps will be pretty close. Again, these teams most recently played, and Florida's looked pretty good in their most recent form. Their respawn has looked pretty good, and their S&D, I think, is pretty strong as well. So, yeah, it may be close, but I think OpTic Texas realizes that this is their best chance at a championship so far in this season. The number 1 overall seed again, and I do not think that they will let it slip away. They start with a lot of momentum here in Major 5, and I'll give it to them in a 3-0 fashion. Moving on to our last match on Friday, we have the Boston Breach taking on the Minnesota Rocker. Pretty important matchup in terms of seeding, relatively. I'm going to give this one actually to Boston in a 3-2. Yeah, a little bit of sound EQ cheese from Boston Online, but I think they're able to make it happen. Minnesota Rocker have had a lot of momentum. You talk honeymoon period, but for whatever reason, I just see them clutching up in the S&D. Beans has been pretty solid this stage. One of the best players in the league in terms of overall KD. And I think this team shows up. I think Vivid really helps them on LAN. I'll give it to Boston in a 3-2 fashion. Moving on to Friday, we have one of our 2 really long Call of Duty days here. And we're going to kick things off with the Minnesota Rocker taking on the London Royal Ravens in losers round 1. I'll give this one to Rocker in a 3-0 fashion. I think that London is absolutely cooked. And it's pretty interesting to see what they're going to end up doing over, the season, looking forward to the new game. We'll cover that in another video, but hot 3-0 here for the Minnesota Rocker. They rebound after the honeymoon period supposedly ends. Moving on to our second matchup, we have the New York Subliners taking on the Los Angeles Guerrillas. I'll give this one to New York 3-1. Too much firepower, pretty similar to London Royal Ravens. This team has already been eliminated from champs, and I think New York has a lot to play for here. I think that they rebound after a, tough round 1 matchup again against Toronto, but I think they refocus, they take care of business. LAG has some fight, but they take care of it by score of 3-1. For our next matchup, we have the Florida Mutineers taking on Los Angeles Thieves. And in short, I'm going to give this one to LAT. I think just such a very strong LAN team. I think they understand some of the mistakes they were making. Obviously, after you win a championship, a lot of odd study is done on your team, your strategies, and particularly on certain maps. And I think that, I don't know if it's that they're going to counter this meta in a way, but again, I just think they show up on LAN. So I'm going to give this one to LAT by score of 3-1. Moving on to our fourth matchup on Friday, we have the Atlanta FaZe taking on the Seattle Surge, and this is a little bit what I was hinting about earlier on, talking about sort of the race for champs, and it's a worst nightmare for Seattle. and they're going to lose this matchup and get rounded here. I have the Atlanta FaZe taking this one 3-1. They looked a lot more consistent in the respawns, and in terms of their S&D, it's been absolutely stellar throughout the whole season, and I think they're just a little bit too strong for Seattle at this point. A lot to think about for them, and they're just going to pray that they keep their champs hopes alive. And even at that point, I'm not sure if they're able to turn out, but Atlanta FaZe is just too strong in this one. I'll give this one to the Atlanta FaZe in a 3-1 fashion. And finally, to wrap up our Friday slate, in losers round 2, we had the Atlanta FaZe taking on the New York Subliners, and I'm going to have this one being a little bit spicy. I'm actually going to give this one to the Atlanta FaZe by way of 3-2. They'll win a Game 5 S&D. I think these teams match up pretty well. I think some of the pacings can be pretty interesting between the Terrors and Kismet and Hydra. Hydra's been playing absolutely phenomenal, and I think Priest has been pretty consistent at this point. I think he might be an X factor for this New York Subliners team, but the mid-rounders, I mean, it's just going to be tough to combat that slasher style of S&D, and I'm buying into it. I'm sold. And I just find it hard to believe that this Atlanta FaZe team will lose a Game 5. So many playmakers here on this team, and I think they're just going to be able to get it done, and that's where it's going to end for the New York Subliners. Moving on to our second half of the weekend matches. We'll start on Saturday. Another long day for us, another great day of Call of Duty. We have, in the first matchup, the LA Thieves taking on the Minnesota Rocker, and it's been pretty one-sided in this series throughout the year, but in that same light, I'm going to give this one to LAT by way of 3-2. Yes, Rocker have looked better. They have a lot to play for in this series as well, but just have to buy into the LAT teamwork overall. I find it hard to believe that they continue to struggle, especially on LAN, and I sort of like the map for LAT a little bit better, obviously not knowing them right now. Map pool is just a little bit better, so I'll give this one to LAT in a little bit of a scary one by way of 3-2. Moving on to our next matchup, we have a winners round 2 matchup between OpTic Texas and the Boston Breach, and in this one, I'm going to give this one to OpTic Texas in a 3-1, and some people might think that, I should probably give Florida a map over the Boston Breach just based off of current form, but at the same time, obviously not a time to test in Major 3, but I think OpTic Texas will sort of take their chances on particular maps, and Boston Breach has been one of the better control teams. They may end up dropping that after a hot 2-0 start, but regardless, I'll give this one to OpTic Texas by way of 3-1. Moving on to our third matchup, another big one here. We have the Las Vegas Legion taking on the Toronto Ultra in winners round 2 as well. And unfortunately, I think it's just a little bit overmatched for Las Vegas Legion. I really like the playstyle of the Toronto Ultra. Their form has been really good. I love the swagger that they have coming into the match, a lot of it by Scrappy. But regardless, I think they take this one in a 3-0. And it might be a little bit surprising. Obviously, I think Las Vegas Legion might put up a little bit more of a fight. But I like this one in a 3-0. I think Toronto has their head down. They have their home crowd behind them, and, I think it's just going to be a 3-0 by way of Toronto. Moving on to our fourth matchup, we have the Boston Breach taking on the Atlanta FaZe, and this is where it ends for Boston. They're not going to be able to overcome the sound EQ cheese on LAN, or rather, they're not going to be able to keep up that same form. Again, just reiterating on some of the things about the Atlanta FaZe. Looked a lot better in respawns. Their S&D continues to be really solid. That control mode might be a little bit of a struggle for them. I like Boston in the control, which is why I give them a 3-1. But I think Atlanta FaZe really stays locked in as they continue to push for champs, and they try and lock in that number 1 seed, which will obviously be a little bit of an uphill battle for them, coming out of losers as I have predicted losing to the Las Vegas Legion. And finally, to wrap up our Saturday slate, we have the Las Vegas Legion taking on Los Angeles Thieves, and this is unfortunately where I see it ending for Las Vegas, and pulled for them all year. Sort of just thought that things were lining up for them. Their team had a lot of great momentum. They had an incredibly hard split here in Major 5. They ended up making winners, which, pat on the back to them, was an incredible accomplishment. I thought they put themselves in a very good spot to be able to secure a championship spot. But at the same time, Minnesota Rockers sort of put the ball in their own court, made the change, it worked out, and, we may not end up seeing them at champs. I kind of didn't account how all these points are going to play out, so we'll have to stay tuned. Obviously, these are predictions on just the matches themselves. You never know what may happen, but I'm going to give this one to LAT in a 3-1. Really love the teamwork aspect of this team, especially on LAN. Map pool, I think, is a little bit better. S&Ds, I think, are pretty similar. Obviously, I think Vegas is a little bit better, but in terms of respawn, I really do like LAT. Vegas is a pretty bad control team, and I think that it's going to be a little bit too much for them to overcome here in this series. And moving on to Championship Sunday, one of the best days in Call of Duty every time that the major rolls around. We have 4 matches, and we'll break them down for you starting right now. We have OpTic Texas in the first matchup in Winners Final, taking on the Toronto Ultra, the home crowd. I have OpTic Texas taking this one 3-1. This is the same way that the series went earlier on in Major 5 qualifiers, and I think OpTic Texas are just really the team to beat. Scrappy said it himself in a post-game interview recently, and I just think they continue to show up. I think they know that they're hungry. They know this is their best chance to end up taking a tournament and being able to come out with a win this season. Obviously, Champs is right around the corner, probably the hottest team. And by probably, I mean definitely the hottest team in this game at the moment. And I think they continue to ride that. They, when they played Toronto last, the maps were good for them. They challenged them on Hotel. It ended up working out. Not sure exactly what maps we'll end up seeing in this series, but I like OpTic Texas here by way of 3-1. Moving on to our next matchup on Championship Sunday, we have losers round 4. We have the Los Angeles Thieves taking on the Atlanta FaZe, rather. Got my mind wrapped around the Toronto Ultra. But I'm going to give this one to the Atlanta FaZe by a score of 3-2. I think that their respawn has been considerably better the past stage overall. I think that Slashers looked a lot better, and when this Atlanta FaZe team ends up winning some respawns, I think that makes them a very dangerous team. Even though they have to make this run from losers, I think that, in my mind, this makes a lot of sense. Their players individually are sort of peaking at the right time. Simp is coming around and really one of the best players this past stage, as well as playing really well in Major 4. And Abizi hasn't played great, you could say, as sort of a counter argument, but it's only a matter of time. He's one of the best players in this game so far when taking a entire season standpoint. So I think this team's able to bounce back and really make a strong push here in Major 5. Obviously heading up to the Champs tournament. This is, the big one. I think their players all realize what they're playing for, and I think they'll lock it in. So I'm going to give this one to the Atlanta FaZe by way of 3-2. For our next series, we have losers final, which will be the Toronto Ultra taking on the Atlanta FaZe, and this is where I see it ending for FaZe. It would be an incredible run for them to end up making this run all the way from losers round 1. Obviously, starting in winners, I have them predicted losing to the Las Vegas Legion, but Toronto's got the home crowd behind them. Scrappy, I think, is one of the best players in the game. He's really been hitting form recently. Toby, aka Kleenex, has been playing great, and I just think on land this team's able to make it happen. I think that a lot of the things line up for them well in this series. We've seen them play before in high leverage spots, and Toronto's been able to make it happen. So, without too much drama, I'll give this one to Toronto 3-1. FaZe probably win the S&D, but Toronto really one of the most consistent and most dominant teams in terms of the respawn modes. They're one of the best control teams in the game, potentially the best, and I think they're able to get it done in this series. And finally, for the big daddy of them all, we're talking about the grand final. We have OpTic Texas, a rematch from Major 3, OpTic Texas and the Toronto Ultra, and without a shock to a lot of people, I have OpTic Texas taking this matchup 4-1 actually, which I have being pretty dominant. I think that with OpTic Texas being able to make this run out of winners, pretty favorable first two matchups. I think they're able to take care of Toronto Ultra again, like I mentioned in winners final, but I think that with having the veto advantage overall, I think it makes a lot of sense that OpTic Texas are finally able to get it done and hoist the tournament north of the border. I think that some of the maps that they struggled on, one they've potentially gotten better at. Obviously, the Hotel S&D was a little bit of a throw. And El Asilo, if we end up getting to that point, I don't believe that we're going to see that map. Although, at the same time, obviously, an absolute bang out for them on Hotel Control. In their last matchup, 5 offensive wins. Most of them pretty quick by both teams as well. So, it'll be pretty interesting to see, but I really like OpTic Texas in the respawn and S&D. And I think that they get it done rather dominantly, and I think that they get a lot of momentum as we move forward towards champs. They're locked in. They know what they need to do. And obviously, Major 5 success correlates pretty well over to champs. You guys already know who I'm going to pick for champs. But that's going to do it for this video, guys. My Major 5 prediction. Let me know what you guys think of some of the notes and some of the storylines that are going to be going on here this next weekend north of the border. Going to be incredibly exciting. Obviously, we wrapped up the online qualifiers for the year this past weekend. No more sound EQ cheese, at least for this year. Hopefully, we have permanent dead silence next year, but obviously, all you can do is hope. But let me know what you guys think of my prediction of OpTic Texas going all the way and lifting the trophy here in Major 5. I'm sure some of you guys obviously have them as the front runner, which they definitely should be, but you never know. As they say, it's Call of Duty, and it's so day-to-day, and it's MW2, as a lot of players have also said. But for now, that's going to do it for this video, guys. This has been your boy, Frankie Bones, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Peace out.